You have been told to reduce salt your entire adult life. Every physician visit, every dietary guideline, every heart-healthy label on every package in every aisle. Less salt, watch your sodium, cut back. The advice assumes you are eating too much, and most people are. But the advice never explains what salt is actually doing inside your body, what it maintains, what it powers, what collapses when it drops below the body can sustain. The physics of salt inside your body is the physics of electricity, and the substance you have been reducing is the substrate that makes every electrical event in your nervous system, your muscles, and your heart possible. Salt is the substrate that maintains the electrical voltage across every cell membrane in your body. Every nerve signal is a controlled collapse of that voltage. Every muscle contraction depends on it. Every heartbeat is generated by it. The sodium-potassium pump that creates the gradient consumes the body's largest resting energy expenditure, spending the dominant share of its energy at rest on a single electrochemical gradient because everything else depends on it. The question is, what happens when the gradient fails? Inside every cell membrane sits an enzyme called the sodium-potassium pump. Each cycle of this pump moves 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions in. 3 out, 2 in. The net export of 1 positive charge per cycle creates a voltage difference across the membrane. The inside of the cell becomes negative relative to the outside, approximately negative 70 millivolts. A tiny voltage measured in thousandths of a volt, maintained across a membrane only 5 nanometers thick. But the voltage per unit thickness is enormous. Negative 70 millivolts across 5 nanometers translates to approximately 14 million volts per meter, a field strength comparable to the voltages inside electronic components. Your cells run at field strengths that would concern an electrical engineer. The voltage is invisible, unfelt, and unmeasured by any sensation the body produces. You carry 14 million volts per meter across every cell membrane in your body and feel nothing. The voltage reveals itself only through its consequences, the nerve signal, the muscle contraction, the heartbeat. When those consequences falter, the voltage has already dropped. Each pump cycle consumes 1 molecule of adenosine triphosphate, the universal cellular fuel. The pump hydrolyzes the ATP, captures the released energy, and uses it to force sodium and potassium against their concentration gradients, pushing sodium to where sodium is already concentrated and pulling potassium to where potassium is already concentrated. Moving ions against their gradient requires energy for the same reason pushing water uphill requires energy. The thermodynamic gradient resists the transport at every cycle. The pump runs continuously against this resistance, consuming ATP without pause, maintaining the gradient without rest, running while you sleep, while you eat, while you exercise, while you do nothing at all. The pump never stops because the gradient never stops because the body requires the voltage every second of every day. If the pump stopped for even a few minutes, the concentration gradients would begin to equalize as sodium leaked back into the cell and potassium leaked out through passive channels, and the voltage would decay toward zero. The pump is the single most expensive continuous process in the body, running in every cell, across every tissue, without interruption, for the entire duration of your life. When cells are deprived of oxygen and ATP production falls, the pump is the first process to slow, because it consumes more energy than any other single enzyme in the cell. Within minutes of ATP depletion, the gradient begins to equalize. Sodium leaks in, potassium leaks out, and the voltage decays. This is the physics of what happens in a stroke or a heart attack at the cellular level. The pump loses its fuel, the gradient collapses, and the electrical activity the tissue depends on ceases. Roth and Brown measured the cumulative energy cost of this pump in physiological reviews, approximately 30% of the body's resting metabolic rate. Across 37 trillion cells, each running approximately 10 billion pump cycles per day, the energy bill is the largest single expenditure in the body at rest. You spend nearly a third of your resting energy maintaining 1 electrochemical gradient. The body does not allocate a third of its resting budget to something optional. It allocates that energy because every signal the nervous system sends, every contraction a muscle produces, every beat the heart generates runs on the voltage this gradient creates. A battery stores energy as a chemical gradient and releases it as electrical current when a circuit closes. Your cells operate on the identical principle. Sodium concentrated outside the membrane, potassium concentrated inside, creates a stored electrochemical potential that can be released as ion current through protein channels that open and close on demand. The cell is a battery. Sodium is the electrolyte. The pump is the charger running continuously, spending ATP to maintain the charge the entire system depends on. What happens when the battery discharges? Every nerve signal in your body is the controlled momentary destruction of that voltage. A stimulus arrives at a nerve cell and reaches a threshold voltage of approximately -55 millivolts. At that threshold, voltage-gated sodium channels in the membrane snap open. Sodium ions that the pump spent energy pushing out now rush back in at approximately 100 million ions per second per channel. 100 million ions through a single protein pore in a single second per channel. The membrane potential swings from the resting voltage to positive 40 millivolts in under a millisecond, a 110 millivolt voltage change in less than a thousandth of a second. The speed of this reversal is what makes nerve signaling possible. The voltage change must be fast enough to trigger the next channel down the line before the current dissipates. The entire event from channel opening to voltage peak to channel closing lasts approximately 1 millisecond. The depolarization window for a complete electrical signal to form, propagate to the next channel, and reset. 1,000th of a second. The time between the moment your finger touches a hot surface and the moment you begin to pull away is the time it takes for this voltage wave to propagate from your fingertip to your spinal cord and back. Each segment of the journey powered by the gradient sodium maintains. After the depolarization window closes, the sodium channel inactivates, closing its gate from the inside. Voltage-gated potassium channels, which respond to the same voltage change but open more slowly, now allow potassium to rush out, carrying positive charge out of the cell and driving the voltage back toward the resting potential. The sodium-potassium pump then restores the original ion distribution, pumping the sodium back out and the potassium back in, recharging the gradient for the next signal at a cost of 1 ATP molecule per pump cycle. Now the signal propagates along the axon as a wave of sequential depolarization. Each patch of membrane that depolarizes generates enough current to trigger the next patch, and the wave travels the full length of the nerve without losing strength. In myelinated fibers, the signal jumps between gaps in the insulation called nodes of Ranvier at up to 120 meters per second. In unmyelinated fibers, continuous propagation moves at 1 to 2 meters per second. The conduction velocity the name's discussion described declining with age depends on a voltage gradient maintained by sodium. The processing speed that slowed was partly a voltage problem, and the voltage is maintained by the substance you have been told to eliminate. Hodgkin and Huxley modeled this process in 1952 using the same circuit equations electrical engineers use for transmission lines. Voltage represented by membrane potential, current represented by ion flux through the channels, conductance represented by channel opening probability, capacitance represented by the lipid bilayer's ability to store charge across its 5 nanometer thickness. The cell membrane operates as a circuit, and the circuit runs on the voltage the sodium-potassium pump maintains. The Nobel Prize in 1963 was awarded for proving the nervous system runs on the physics of electrical engineering applied to biological membranes. My understanding of the advice changed the afternoon I learned what the voltage does. Every thought you are having at this moment is a voltage wave propagating through your nervous system, powered by the gradient sodium maintains. Without sodium, the wave cannot form. Well, the nerve waits to be told to fire. The heart generates its own signal without external instruction. Pacemaker cells in the sinoatrial node produce spontaneous depolarization driven by sodium and calcium currents that cycle without external input. No nerve signal tells these cells when to fire. No external pacemaker drives the rhythm. The heart generates its own electricity from the ion gradients maintained by the sodium-potassium pump, producing approximately 100,000 beats per day without a single external signal telling it when to fire. The ion channels in the pacemaker membrane open and close in a self-sustaining rhythm, each cycle producing a voltage wave that spreads across the atrial muscle, triggering contraction at each wavefront. The wave passes through the atrioventricular node, a brief delay that allows the atria to finish contracting before the ventricles begin, then propagates through specialized conducting fibers to trigger ventricular contraction in a coordinated sequence that ejects blood with each beat. Every electrocardiogram is the surface-level recording of this process, millions of cardiac cells depolarizing and repolarizing in sequence, a sodium-driven voltage wave propagating through the heart muscle, each peak and valley on the tracing corresponding to a specific phase of the ion channel cycle in the cardiac cells beneath. The rhythm is electrical, the contraction is mechanical. The electrical event precedes and causes the mechanical event, and the electrical event depends entirely on the sodium gradient the pump maintains. When sodium drops, this sequence distorts. The gradient distortion alters the duration of each action potential, stretching the interval between ventricular depolarization and repolarization. Risk of arrhythmia rises because the electrical sequence loses its precise timing. In severe cases, the heart's rhythm degenerates because the gradient it was built to run on has been pulled below the voltage the pacemaker channels require. The heart that beats 80,000 times per day without being told depends on a gradient maintained by the ion you have been told to restrict. The gradient has a breaking point. What happens to the body when that gradient fails in stages? Normal serum sodium sits between 135 and 145 milliequivalents per liter. The gradient is maintained within a 10-unit window, a precision the body defends with a multi-hormone cascade because the voltage and the osmotic pressure both depend on sodium sitting within that range. Outside this window, the physics changes in a predictable, dose-dependent sequence. Emergency physicians see regularly. Mild deficit between 130 and 135. Nausea, headache, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. The voltage gradient is compressed. Action potentials still propagate, but with reduced amplitude and velocity. Every nerve signal takes slightly longer to travel, slightly longer to arrive, slightly longer to produce the response. You feel off, a processing slowdown resembling the lag the names discussion described, but caused by a voltage deficit rather than a bandwidth deficit. Two different physics producing overlapping symptoms that you would never connect to the salt shaker you stopped using. The morning you woke up with a headache and blamed dehydration. The afternoon you could not concentrate and blamed poor sleep. The evening you felt exhausted and blamed your age. Each of those days may have carried a voltage deficit as one of its contributing causes. Moderate deficit, between 125 and 130. Confusion, muscle cramps, unsteady gait. Action potentials fire unreliably. Muscle cells receiving erratic voltage signals produce involuntary sustained contraction. The cramp that arrives without warning, the calf that seizes during the night, the hand that locks mid-grip. Gait instability reflects cerebellar circuits running on a distorted gradient, the balance calculations that depend on rapid, precise electrical signaling, faltering because the voltage that carries the signal has dropped below the operating specification. If you attributed these symptoms to aging, you may have been experiencing subclinical sodium deficit from overly aggressive salt restriction combined with high water intake and never made the connection because nobody measured the gradient. The cramp that wakes you at 3 in the morning, the one you stretch out and forget by breakfast, may carry a voltage story the stretching does not address. The gait that feels slightly less stable on uneven ground, the balance that required concentration where it once required none, may reflect a gradient operating below its specification rather than a body simply getting older. And then, severe deficit, below 125. Seizures, coma, and death. At this level, a second physics joins the voltage collapse. Sodium is the primary osmotic solute in extracellular fluid. Water crosses cell membranes following concentration gradients through channels called aquaporins, moving from regions of lower solute concentration to regions of higher solute concentration. When extracellular sodium drops, the concentration outside the cell falls below the concentration inside. The gradient reverses and water flows into cells. Every cell in the body absorbs water it was never meant to hold. Most cells swell and survive because the tissue around them can expand to accommodate the volume increase. Skin stretches and muscle fascia gives. The swelling distributes across flexible compartments without reaching a pressure that damages the tissue. Brain cells swell inside the skull. This is the physics that separates hyponatremia from every other electrolyte disturbance. Inside the skull, there is zero capacity for expansion. When brain cells absorb water through the reversed osmotic gradient, the brain's volume increases inside a box that cannot grow to accommodate it. Intracranial pressure rises with every fraction of a percent the brain volume increases because the rigid bone surrounding the brain offers no give, no flex, no ability to expand the container to match the expanding contents. The mild headache at 1:30 is the early pressure signal. The confusion at 128 is the cortex under compression. The seizures at 120 are the voltage collapse and the pressure increase operating simultaneously on neurons that can no longer fire in coordinated patterns. Below 115, the brain is being compressed against its own container by water it absorbed through osmotic physics, and the compression can be fatal. I recognized the first three symptoms on the mild list the evening I read Adrogué and Matias's finding in the New England Journal of Medicine that thiazide diuretics are the most common medication cause of sodium deficit in older adults: headache, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. Three symptoms I had attributed to a dozen other causes on days when my water intake was high and my salt intake was deliberately low. The physics behind those symptoms was a gradient I was unknowingly compressing. Voltage failure and pressure failure running simultaneously from one deficit, two consequences of one shortage operating through two different physics. Who actually reaches these levels? The question shifts. Three paths reach clinically significant sodium deficit, and each one arrives through a different mechanism you rarely connect to sodium. A marathon runner drinks liters of water without electrolyte replacement during an endurance event. Sodium stays in the blood. The water that diluted it is what changed. The runner's blood volume expands with every cup of water consumed, but the total sodium in the blood stays approximately constant because the kidneys cannot excrete the excess water fast enough during exercise. The sodium concentration, milliequivalents per liter, drops because the liter expanded while the milliequivalents stayed the same. The concentration falls below the threshold where nerves and muscles function normally, and the runner collapses with symptoms indistinguishable from dehydration, which leads well-meaning bystanders to give more water, which makes the deficit worse. Hugh Butler and colleagues reported multiple marathon deaths from this mechanism in the Clinical Journal of Sport Medicine. The treatment is restricting fluid intake, the exact opposite of the instinct everyone at the scene will follow. The runner who drank too much water experienced a sodium problem because dilution and depletion produce gradient failure through different physics. An older adult taking thiazide diuretics for high blood pressure. Thiazides work by increasing renal sodium excretion, reducing blood volume, reducing pressure. The physics of how thiazides affect the sodium gradient is electrochemistry. The drug increases the rate at which the kidneys filter sodium out of the blood and excrete it in urine, pulling the gradient down from the excretion side while the dietary intake remains unchanged or deliberately restricted. Whether the medication is appropriate for a specific individual is a clinical decision between patient and physician. What follows teaches the physics. The physician manages the prescription. The medication cause Adrogué and Matias identified is the most common path to sodium deficit in older adults. The patient who was told to reduce salt for the blood pressure, then given a drug that reduces sodium further through renal excretion, can arrive at the deficit the body was fighting to prevent through two simultaneous reductions that were never coordinated against each other. A person who eliminated processed food, which contains approximately 70% of dietary sodium in Western diets, stopped adding salt at the table, and drinks large volumes of water throughout the day. No single dramatic drop, gradual erosion over weeks and months. The body compensates through aldosterone, the hormone that signals the kidneys to retain sodium, increasing reabsorption until the compensation reaches its limit. Symptoms arrive slowly: fatigue attributed to aging, confusion attributed to memory decline, cramps attributed to magnesium deficiency. Each symptom assigned to a different cause because nobody measured the gradient. The fatigue, the confusion, and the cramps were all real. The sodium level was never checked because the symptoms looked like everything else that accompanies aging, and the possibility that deliberate sodium restriction might have reached the point where the body's compensation could no longer hold was never raised because the advice never mentioned a floor. Sodium deficit hiding behind other diagnoses is the scenario that applies most directly to you if you have been following the advice for decades. You reduced salt because you were told to. You eliminated processed food because the health guidance recommended it. You drank water throughout the day because hydration advice encouraged it. Each decision was individually reasonable and individually supported by health guidance. The cumulative effect of all three acting on the sodium gradient simultaneously was never discussed because the advice treated sodium as something to minimize rather than something to manage within a range. The dose question has a shape. Now the relationship between sodium intake and cardiovascular harm follows a curve you have never been shown, and the shape of the curve changes everything about how the advice should be understood. Too much sodium raises blood pressure. Too little collapses the gradient. What does the relationship between dose and harm actually look like? If the relationship between dose and harm were a straight line, the advice would be simple: less is always better, and zero is best. The relationship follows a different shape entirely. O'Donnell and colleagues documented this shape in The Lancet across 101,945 participants in 17 countries in a study called PURERER. The relationship between sodium intake and cardiovascular events follows a J-shaped curve. Mortality increases above 5 grams per day, the right arm of the curve where excess sodium drives excess pressure. Mortality also increases below 3 grams per day, the left arm of the curve where deficit erodes the gradient the body depends on. The lowest risk occupies a range approximately 3 to 5 grams of sodium per day, roughly 1.5 to 2.5 teaspoons of table salt. A window, not a direction. Both sides of the window carry consequences. The curve is shaped like the letter J because the left arm, the deficit arm, rises more steeply than the right arm, the excess arm. The lowest point, the safest range, sits between 3 and 5 grams, and the advice that says only reduce without specifying where to stop can push you past the lowest point and onto the rising left arm where the gradient erodes and the symptoms begin. If you followed the advice most diligently, reduced furthest, eliminated most completely, you may have moved furthest onto the arm where the risk climbs. The irony is precise. The most compliant patient may have the most to learn from the curve the advice never showed you. Evidence calibration matters here because this curve sits at the center of an active scientific debate. The American Heart Association disputes the methodology of the PURE study, arguing that the measurement technique, spot urine samples, underestimates true sodium intake, and that reverse causation may explain the left arm of the curve, sicker people eating less rather than less salt making people sick. The curve is documented across the largest observational study of its kind. The interpretation is actively debated by the organizations responsible for dietary guidelines. What follows presents the data. You hold the uncertainty. The scientific community has not yet resolved whether the left arm reflects causation or correlation, and until that resolution arrives, the data is what exists. The curve is published, the debate is ongoing, and if you reduced sodium to 2 grams per day, you deserve to see the curve and decide what it means for your own intake. Well, the reduced salt message that specifies no floor is giving half the prescription. If you successfully reduce sodium to 2 grams per day, which many health-conscious adults over 55 have done through decades of deliberate restriction, you move from the right arm of the curve, mild excess with modest risk, to the left arm, deficit with rising risk. The curve shows that the optimal range is a window, and either side of the window carries consequences the single-direction advice never mentioned. I looked at the curve the week I found it, and traced my own intake across 2 decades of deliberate restriction. The floor I had been aiming for was below the range the data identified as lowest risk. The advice I followed for 20 years specified a ceiling without ever mentioning a floor, and the distance between the two is where the gradient lives or dies. Why does the body fight this hard to keep sodium? What kind of defense system does it deploy? Your body has no sodium storage. Unlike calcium stored in bone, glucose stored as glycogen, or energy stored as fat, there is no sodium reserve to draw on during deficit. The body manages sodium in real time, monitoring the concentration continuously and responding to any drop with a defense system whose complexity reveals how much the body values what it is protecting. When sodium falls, the kidneys detect the drop in blood volume and release an enzyme called renin. Renin converts a circulating protein to angiotensin 1. A second enzyme converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, a potent vasoconstrictor that immediately raises blood pressure by narrowing the blood vessels, buying time by maintaining perfusion pressure while the body addresses the sodium deficit. Angiotensin 2 simultaneously signals the adrenal glands to release aldosterone, the hormone that instructs the kidneys to reabsorb nearly 100% of filtered sodium, returning it to the blood instead of excreting it in urine. The kidneys shift from excreting sodium to hoarding it, sacrificing potassium excretion to retain sodium. The kidneys will excrete potassium, an ion the heart also depends on, to retain sodium, an ion the entire electrical system depends on. The trade-off reveals the hierarchy. Sodium sits above potassium in the body's electrochemical priority because the membrane potential depends more heavily on the sodium gradient than on any other single factor. Every organ system in the body coordinates simultaneously to retain a single ion. The intensity of the defense reveals the importance of the substrate. The body does not build a cascade this complex, this responsive, this expensive to maintain to protect something optional. The body builds this cascade because sodium is the electrolyte that charges the gradient, and without the gradient, every electrical event in the body stops. What the cascade reveals is the answer to the question the advice never asked. What is the minimum sodium intake required to keep the voltage intact? The body's multi-organ defense system, the cascade that hoards every filtered sodium ion and spends the body's largest resting energy share maintaining one gradient, reveals what the advice left out. Salt is the substrate the electrical system runs on. The body always understood what the advice never explained.